Good morning, Thesis advisors. As you know, on Saturday, students should have sent to you their research question or questions that they're proposing for their business thesis, as well as hypotheses, if in fact those are appropriate for their research. And they should also have sent to you by now also a reading table where they summarize about 8 journal articles that are related to their research question. So what should we be looking for in these assignments, and what kind of feedback should we be providing the students? I think there are two main things that we should look for at this point. One is the research question tractable? Can there be a realistic expectation that this question can be answered over the course of the next academic year, or this academic year? And the second thing that we're looking for at this point is evidence that students have started to consult journal articles closely related to their research question. So the first issue about the question being tractable, we have to think about, is it even theoretically possible that students could answer this question? Does the data needed to answer this question exist at all? If it exists, is it likely that students can have access to this data? The way that students have posed the question oftentimes is too broad, so sometimes you may have to tell them to narrow it down. For example, they might want to know about the job satisfaction and organizational commitment of workers, but they might be proposing that they will work with one particular company in Klaipėda. So perhaps you may need to tell them to right away to think of their population that they're investigating as much more narrow than all workers, or all European workers, or all Lithuanian workers. Perhaps they need to think about it just as workers of that company, so that perhaps they're approaching it as a case study. So, does the data exist? Can the question be theoretically answered? Can the question be answered even theoretically? So, meaning if you know right away that there's no data that exists that can help students answer this question, then we should guide the students away from this question. For example, one student proposed a question this week that was, is economic growth consistent with Christian values? This is an interesting question, of course, but it is hard to imagine that the question could be answered either as a yes or a no based on some empirical evidence that students could collect over this academic year. So we should encourage students to make it more narrow. For example, is there evidence that economic growth is correlated with the percentage of Christian population in a country, or that maybe economic growth is correlated with democratization, some index values that actually exist. So something like that could be more tractable than this very broad question about does economic growth, is it consistent with Christian values? So we're looking to see whether questions are tractable. Also, if the student is proposing to do a case study or to collect data from interviews, then already start thinking about whether it's likely that companies would cooperate with the student. We had a student propose studying organizational commitment of workers to their companies. And right away we have to give a student a warning that it's unlikely that any of their respondents will objectively and honestly tell them if, in fact, their organizational commitment to the company is very low. It's unlikely to imagine that a student will ask, or maybe give a survey to workers, tell us about the extent of your organizational commitment to the company, and somebody will say, well, my organizational commitment is very low and I'm looking to leave. And so if it's unlikely that workers will respond like that, then we have to ask can the student expect to get quality data? So these are kind of things we want to think about right off the bat, but whether or not the question is tractable. Can it be worked? Can it be answered? The second thing that we're looking for, as I said, is there evidence the student has consulted literature? So that's why the reading table should have been sent to you. If it is not, then please be very strict with the thesis student. Ask them to send it by some date that's very soon, maybe Wednesday or Thursday of this week. And at that point, if they still haven't done so, then they could be disqualified from the thesis process. They could fail the course early on. We do need them to stay on top of the deadlines. If they delay reading and consulting material, then they will go down the wrong path much easier. We want students to read journal articles related to their research question so that, first of all, they would know what is already known about their question or something similar to it. And second of all, so that they could start understanding what variables are involved, what data sets are involved. They could see ideas that other researchers have had about answering a similar question, and then they could incorporate those ideas later in their own chapter 3 in their methodology. So both things about question being tractable and about literature, those really are later chapters. So question being tractable, that's a question of chapter 3, methodology. And whether or not they're consulting literature, well, of course, students will develop their literature review in chapter 2. But even at this early stage, they should be thinking about those things ahead. And so that's the kind of things that we as business thesis advisors should be considering and should be raising with students even now as we give them feedback tomorrow about their early research questions and or hypotheses. And by the way, not every thesis needs to have hypotheses. So hypotheses are only appropriate if they can be either if there's a good chance to reject them using empirical data. If a student is asking a broader question, for example, what are the characteristics of workers' organizational commitment in logistics industry? Okay, so that's not really a hypothesis, that can be a research question, and it's perfectly fine for our business thesis students not to have hypotheses. Then they would simply do maybe an exploratory study, an investigation of some kind, where the result would not be accepting or rejecting a hypothesis, but rather presenting the results of their findings. And final thing here for early feedback on business thesis is this, that we want to make sure that if students choose not to do a quantitative thesis, instead if they do qualitative thesis work, maybe they do interviews with a small number of respondents, then we want to make sure they do take advantage of the benefits of qualitative research methods. So we need to encourage them to read the chapters on qualitative research in their thesis textbook. We want to make sure they go deep in their interviews. They give us a lot of color, a lot of layers of information about the particular situation they're studying. Pretty much the worst thing that students can do is they could start out saying, I need 200 responses for my survey, so I'll do a quantitative analysis. And then as they start administering survey, they realize nobody's responding to them, so they finish out with 15 responses, and they say, well, this is no longer quantitative, it's now qualitative, but they haven't given us any additional depth. So if students do qualitative work, then they should provide the kind of depth that is expected from qualitative research. Lots of detail, lots of insights into particular cases of people. They should really be familiar with the people who are responding if their group of respondents is small. So hopefully this can be helpful in how we think about giving early feedback for students about the research questions. Thank you for advising our students.